Europe, 1944. The Third Reich was collapsing under its own delusions of superiority. In the chaos of retreat, thousands of German soldiers, among them doctors, surgeons, and field medics, found themselves surrounded, captured, and shipped across the Atlantic to a country they had been told was barbaric. They had been fed propaganda all their lives, that Americans were crude, materialistic, uncultured, a people who couldn't possibly understand honor or discipline. And yet, what awaited them in the camps of Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas would shatter everything they thought they knew. Many of these captured German physicians had served on the Eastern Front, where mercy was a rare currency. They had seen horrors, gangrene, starvation, frostbite, and the endless flow of bodies. For years, they had been trained to see themselves as the elite of Europe, soldiers of a so-called superior race. So when they were captured by the Allies, they expected humiliation, maybe even death. But as they were processed at the ports of New York and Virginia, something remarkable happened. They were greeted not with brutality, but with respect. American officers, some even medical personnel themselves, addressed them by rank: Herr Doctor, Colonel, Major. One German POW doctor later recalled, "When an American lieutenant saluted me, I was confused. I thought it must be a mistake. In Germany, we never saluted the enemy. At first, they suspected it was a trick. How could their captors be so civil, so professional?" The reality slowly set in. They were now in the hands of a nation that followed a different code, a code that valued humanity even in war. By late 1944, America was holding over 400,000 German POWs across the mainland, more than in any other Allied country. Among them were hundreds of trained doctors, surgeons, and medics from the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe. Camp authorities quickly realized these men could be of use, not as prisoners, but as medical professionals. In many camps, the Americans lacked enough staff to treat the POW population, which was growing every month. Instead of punishing them, the U.S. Army gave German doctors something they had never expected: a chance to continue practicing medicine. Inside the barbed wire fences, makeshift hospitals were built, neat, orderly, and equipped with supplies that seemed luxurious compared to the collapsing hospitals back home in Germany. The irony was staggering. German doctors, once working under the Nazi regime that boasted about Aryan superiority, were now treating their own men with American-provided tools and drugs: penicillin, sulfa powder, sterile gauze, clean surgical instruments. Things that had become rare luxuries in Europe were routine in American camps. For the first time, these men saw the United States not as the enemy, but as the embodiment of what medicine should have been: compassionate, ethical, and deeply human. Yet the shock ran deeper than supplies or comfort. It was the attitude that stunned them most. American medical officers didn't mock them. They didn't treat them as war criminals. They treated them as fellow doctors. Some were even invited into discussions about treatment methods, sanitation protocols, or surgeries. They debated in broken English and accented German, using the universal language of science. In one camp, a German surgeon wrote in his diary, "Greater than, I operated under American supervision today. We spoke not as enemies, but as colleagues. It was the first time I felt like a doctor again, and that realization, that an enemy could still see you as a professional, planted a quiet seed in their minds, a seed that would grow into something powerful in the years to come." The American POW camps were not perfect. They were still prisons, fenced by barbed wire and guarded by soldiers with rifles. But inside those fences, something unexpected unfolded, a microcosm of civility amidst global chaos. In Camp McCain, Mississippi, Camp Swift, Texas, Camp Grant, Illinois, German POW doctors were assigned to treat their fellow prisoners. Each camp had its own small hospital building, staffed jointly by American medics and German prisoners. It was a strange partnership. Enemies by uniform, allies by profession. American officers enforced the Geneva Convention, which required humane treatment of prisoners, but they went beyond mere compliance. Many believed that decency wasn't a weakness, it was a strategic strength. German doctors were stunned by the equality of treatment. In the Wehrmacht, hierarchy was everything. Rank dictated worth, and ideology defined morality. But here, in the heart of enemy territory, A German corporal could speak to an American captain and be listened to. One POW surgeon, Dr. Karl-Heinz Weber, later recalled, "When I asked for new surgical gloves, the American quartermaster said, 'Of course, doctor.' I almost laughed. In Germany, a request like that during wartime would have been seen as arrogance. For many POW physicians, their sense of professional dignity, crushed under the weight of Nazi militarism, began to return. They rediscovered what it meant to heal, not serve a regime. American medical officers encouraged this change. They sometimes invited German doctors to attend lectures, study American surgical methods, or observe operations in nearby hospitals under guard. Imagine that. Men who, months earlier, were serving under Hitler's banner, now standing in sterile American hospitals, watching cutting-edge techniques they had only read about in journals banned by the Nazi censors. It wasn't just about science, it was about values. They learned that American medicine emphasized patient consent, documentation, and ethics, things that had eroded in Germany under Nazi control. Many German doctors had been pressured to participate in wartime experiments or racial fitness programs, things they rarely spoke of in the camps. But when they saw how Americans treated prisoners of war, the contrast was unbearable. Here, even enemy soldiers were given proper care, balanced diets, and humane treatment. One captured Luftwaffe medic whispered to another, "Greater than, if this is how they treat us, how do they treat their own people?" That question haunted them. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted America as racially divided, morally bankrupt, and driven by greed. And yet, in those camps, the Germans saw something else: order, fairness, professionalism. Some American doctors even risked criticism from their superiors for defending their German counterparts. They believed the war might end one day, but the legacy of professional respect would endure. It wasn't uncommon for American surgeons to lend medical books or share research notes. A few German doctors secretly learned English just to read them better. And when the Americans realized this, they started bringing more: journals, manuals, even anatomy charts. That's how the exchange began. By late 1945, German doctors were performing surgeries independently, with American supervision only on paper. Camp hospitals became fully functional systems, staffed by POWs who took immense pride in their work. When epidemics broke out among prisoners, they fought them together. In one case, a diphtheria outbreak was halted thanks to joint efforts between American and German medics, earning praise from U.S. Army Command. Behind the fences, healing became more than a medical act. It became a form of quiet reconciliation. When the war ended in 1945, the world was in ruins. But inside those American POW camps, something profound had already begun to rebuild: trust. German doctors returned home months, sometimes years later. Many went back to cities reduced to rubble. Hospitals were gone. Supplies were non-existent. But they carried with them a different kind of resource, a new vision of what medicine and humanity could be. One former POW physician wrote after his release, "Greater than, the Americans defeated us not just with weapons, but with dignity. They showed us that respect can conquer hate." For these doctors, that experience in captivity became a moral compass. They had seen a system that valued ethics over ideology, compassion over propaganda. Some of them would go on to rebuild West Germany's medical institutions after the war. They introduced new surgical methods, hospital management systems, and ethical codes inspired by what they had witnessed in the U.S. camps. In interviews decades later, several admitted that their worldview had completely changed. They began to understand that professionalism in medicine could transcend borders, even enemies. One American camp commander summarized it perfectly: "Greater than, you can't teach democracy with lectures, you teach it by example." And that's exactly what those POW camps became: living classrooms in humanity. Not all Germans changed, of course. Some remained bitter, refusing to accept what they saw as weakness. But for many, especially the doctors, it was impossible to unsee what they had witnessed: an enemy that healed instead of humiliated, a victor that respected even the defeated. There were touching stories that survived in diaries and letters. An American doctor who secretly sent a German colleague's medical diploma back to his family in Hamburg. a POW surgeon who wept when given his own stethoscope upon release, a small gift from an American major, a camp nurse who said, "War made us enemies, but medicine made us brothers." When these men finally walked out through the gates, many saluted their captors, not as conquerors, but as peers. Years later, some of them even returned to America as guests, scientists, or visiting professors. They lectured in the same universities that had once trained their enemy counterparts. The respect they had been shown didn't fade. It shaped the way they taught their students, emphasizing that medicine was not about ideology, but about service. And so, through the quiet corridors of hospitals and lecture halls, the legacy of those POW camps lived on. In a war defined by hatred and dehumanization, a strange truth emerged from behind barbed wire. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't in battle, but in how you treat the defeated. For those German POW doctors, America's compassion was not just unexpected, it was unforgettable.